So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist today, Eric Bremer, who will discuss intercropping in southern Alberta. Eric Bremer grew up on a dairy farm in BC, but ended up getting a PhD at the U of S in the 1980s, looking into soil nitrogen cycling with pulse crops, including some research on intercropping. He recently had the opportunity to be involved with more research on intercropping in a project with Alberta Ag, which will be the subject of his presentation this morning. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks, Matthew, and thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm just going to get my presentation up. Hopefully you can all see that now. So what I was going to talk about this morning is intercropping, in particular intercropping of pulse crops and oilseed crops in southern Alberta. Now, before I get into intercropping, we're very familiar with monocropping, just growing one crop at once. And why is it that we do that? Well, it's easier, it's less complex. And the other very important thing is that you can optimize the condition for that one species. And then you can scale it up to large fields. And you can get diversity in a monocrop, but you get that by growing a different crop every year. So what's intercropping? Well, that's growing different crops in the same field. For example, instead of growing pea in one field there and canola in another field there, we'll grow them together, and I'll even give them a nice new name, Piola. Now, why would you do that? Well, it's all got to do, well, one is how you would do it. And that's some of what I'm going to get into this morning. Which crops, which cultivars, how do you seed them? When do you seed them? How do you fertilize? How do you control the weeds? And will it pay at the end? Lots of questions. So first off, why is it that it might work? Well, what we're doing now is getting that diversity within 1 year. And part of that diversity is temporal. Some crops like it will take advantage of conditions early. Other crops will take advantage of things later. Or it's spatial. Some crops are more deep rooted, and so they can take advantage of water lower down, and other crops are more shallower, and the same with above ground. They can take advantage of different space for resources. Requirements, in particular, water, light, nutrients, CO2. I'm going to talk mostly about nitrogen as a nutrient, because pulse crops, they can fix their nitrogen, so their requirement for nitrogen is very different than an oilseed crop. And finally, you got diversity because of all kinds of pests, diseases, insects, whatever. That's another sort of area that different crops growing at the same time might be able to respond differently. And so putting that all together, if you grow them together at once, you get this potential for over yield. And because of these synergies that I just talked about, you might get more yield stability. You might be able to reduce your fertilizer or your herbicide, or you might have reduced disease or improved seed quality. Maybe more carbon inputs. You can improve soil health. Well, there has actually been quite a large increase in broad acre intercropping in Alberta and Saskatchewan. I know probably 100,000 acres every year that are done that way. It's because there's seeders, there's herbicide offense. Maybe in the future there might be some kind of robotics potential, which will allow it to be more commonly done. One of the things that you often hear when people are talking about intercropping is the land equivalent ratio. And essentially that's the amount of land you would require to get the same yield if you grew the crops separately as if you grew them together. So in this example, I show you have a pea, let's say it have a 4 ton per hectare yield potential. Canola has a 2. You put them together, you get less on each, 3 for the pea and 1 for the canola. But when you add the 2 together, intercrop divided by monocrop for both, you actually got a 25% overall yield advantage. Now, of course, you do the same thing with the economics part of it. I'm just going to be using that concept a little bit more later. One of the things you'll find if you scientists is that a lot of scientists have been working on this. And here is this relative oil seed yield that I was just talking about. Here's the pulse legume. And to get this yield advantage, you want it to be over 1. And what you can see is that this LER can be over 2 in some cases, but in other cases, it can be even less than 1. So one of the questions that, if you want to make this really work is, well, why is it so different in different places? So that's partly what I'm going to talk about this morning. And it all comes out of a project that we did for a number of years with Dean Pauly and his crew at Alberta Ag when they were there, and with Ben Ellert and his people at Canada, looking at the potential of winter and spring pulse and canola or oilseed crops to increase crop productivity in southern Alberta. And lots of work. The funders were Alberta Pulse Growers and Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. Okay, what did we look at? Well, we had the monocrop system, which would be either lentil or pea monocrop, and we had the oil seed. We had canola in the first year, 2018, and then we moved to mustard because we were finding that we didn't think that the synchrony was where we wanted it to be. So then went from, and then we also have the lentil monocrop intercrop with the oilseed, or the pea intercrop with the oilseed. So those are the main cropping systems. And then we had our intercropping where we varied we kept the pulse at 75% of the monocrop seeding rate. And then we varied the intercrop of the oilseed from 10 to 75%. The idea being that the oil crops like canola are so aggressive that maybe we need to reduce it in order to get the best overall impact. We also played around a little bit with nitrogen rates, either none or with 50 kilos N per hectare or 45 pound per acre. And so those are all the treatments that we looked at. And we did this under dryland and irrigated conditions in 2018, 19, and 20. And in 18, of course, we were very dry. 2019 was still pretty dry. 2020, we actually have pretty comparable, we've got a bit more precept similar between there. And they were done mostly in Lethbridge. The first year we actually were south of Tabor. Okay, here's the seeder that we used, the plot seeder. And what we were doing basically was planting the oilseed in the seed row, a little bit of phos, and we put the pulse crop deeper in the side band attachment. So that's what we did in order to get that depth difference, to get a good establishment of both crops. Here's some pictures at one of our sampling stages, and you can kind of see here's our monocrop of peas, and there's our and you can kind of see here's, I think it's a lentil with canola, and you can kind of see here it is with a low rate of canola, and here it is with a high rate of canola. I'm getting quite overtaken. Just touch base quickly on, well, I mentioned, harvest. What are the issues? We just harvested with a small plot combine and separated them by hand. There are small units that they could use to separate larger things. Once people get more serious, they maybe use some sort of a rotary sieve type of system. I mean, the size of peas and canola is very different. So it's relatively easy to separate them out. Some of the Saskatchewan guys that we looked at, they've set up their whole harvesting system to separate it all immediately after harvest, put everything in separate bins. They went whole hog on it. So there's different ways, but one of the things is you got to do it. You got to make sure that you can do it. One of the other things about harvest, of course, is that the crops have got to come be harvestable at the same time. And then the issue there can be if one gets way ahead of the other. And we were seeing that a bit in 2018, which is a little bit why we shifted into mustard in the other years. And in 2019, that worked great. In 2020, well, 2020 was 2020 in many different ways. But we ended up seeding earlier because of everything. And what happened was that because of the more moisture, a little bit cooler, the mustard didn't mature until much later. Peas still matured, and then we still had quite a bit of shatter loss of the pea. Now, there's things you can do, of course, as far as cultivars and things like that. Stuff that you have to investigate before you do a whole field of that. The other thing I mentioned about was the advantage of competitiveness. We know lentil is a very poor competitor. So this is without nitrogen or with nitrogen. What we find is that pea is actually much more competitive. And if we put mustard is also quite competitive, needs that nitrogen if it's really in poor soil. And when we put those two together, we were also able to get that advantage to produce weeds from south. Another thing I just wanted to quickly show, what's happening with root length over time, weeks after planting. There's lentil at the bottom. It's just slow to get going, doesn't have roots. That's why it's not competitive. Whereas what we found was actually, at least in 2020, under our conditions, the pea had the most rapid root growth. We might have missed some of the very fine canola or mustard roots, but you can kind of see, a little bit what's going on below ground. And you can see why that's, what impact that has a little bit later. We're trying to really figure out where the nitrogen is coming from. Now, there's two forms of nitrogen, the heavier N15 and the normal N14. In air, normally, there's 0.3663% of it is N15. So I'm going to call that a delta N of 0. Our soils naturally are a little bit enriched. They'll have a delta of 6 to 10. And we put on fertilizer that had a del of about 214. So if a pulse crop got all of its nitrogen from the air, it'd have a del of 0. But here it's still maybe fixing 10%. If it was getting it all from the fertilizer, it'd be somewhat higher. The oilseed is going to just get the del that's in the soil, but if you apply this fertilizer, it will go up. And so we can figure out how much is from soil, how much is from the fertilizer, and how much is from the soil. So we can get some idea of competition between these different sources for nitrogen. So here's my del N15 from all my different treatments. And one of the things that's firstly in the pulse crops is that as soon as we start intercropping, the del is going down. And the more this is high rate, the high rate of oilseed, the more oilseeds you got there, the more competition they have for that soil nitrogen, the more they are fixing. So that's really what we wanted to see. If we look at the oilseed, didn't really care. Okay, it's always getting the same del N. This is the unfertilized treatment. We did it in the fertilized treatment, we got much higher, but we're still seeing that same thing. As soon as we intercrop the peas and the lentils that fix more, the oilseed manages to get the same amount of nitrogen, fertilizer nitrogen. Next couple graphs is kind of just looking at the competition between these crops for first fertilizer. We applied the fertilizer we applied, by the way, is UAN at 2 different times. And what I have on this axis here is the number of oilseed plants per pulse plant. So in the lentil, you have a higher seeding rate in the lentil. We actually had as little as about one oilseed crop per, so 10 to 1 in favor of the lentil. Even at that rate, the pulse crop, here's the fraction of nitrogen from the UAN in the oilseed. And almost all of the nitrogen gets into the oilseed crop. Doesn't matter if there's only a few oilseed plants, just because they're very competitive. And we look at the soil nitrogen, the nitrogen they get from the soil, same story. The pea, on the other hand, what we found was, it wasn't beating out the canola in 2018, but actually it was a pretty fair fight when it came to mustard. It was getting pretty well, you know, it was getting as much. If we gave them an even fight, the same number of plants of each, they would have been getting about the same amount of nitrogen from the UAN. When we looked at soil nitrogen, actually the pea and the mustard, no, the canola and the mustard were about equal. So in other words, the pea was actually somewhat more competitive for the soil nitrogen than the fertilizer. We looked at other things that they're competing for, stuff like water and light. Well, I just sort of get a bit of a sense of that by looking at the fraction of dry matter at maximum. So it's the same sort of thing that we saw before. What we can see is that overall, though, even though the lentil does not compete at all for any of the nitrogen, it can actually still get a fair amount of dry matter because it's fixing and it's able to still compete for water and light and other things. In contrast, the pea is much more of a competitive crop. Okay, now let's look at that LER that I was talking to you about. One of the things that we saw was it was very dependent on the amount of nitrogen deficit at these sites. So what we had is we had some sites where there was, so here, this axis here has monocrop oilseed 0 N yield as a fraction of 100 N. Okay, so we had the maximum rate was 100 kilos nitrogen per hectare. And we had some sites where there was very little nitrogen response because it was so dry or there was a lot of nitrogen in the soil. And we had other sites which were extremely responsive. So if we look at the LER for the lentil, we saw that we get a really quite clear relationship when the site is deficient in nitrogen. The LER could be quite high, 1.6 or higher. If there's lots of nitrogen, it comes down pretty rapidly. With the pea, the canola looked kind of similar to what we saw in the lentil, but when we intercropped it with mustard, there wasn't quite the same advantage. And I think it's because of that mustard was less competitive for that nitrogen, and so we couldn't get the advantage. The other things that I have here is, so these LERs are calculated, these ones here are calculated at the same rate of nitrogen or same fertility completely. And you might say, well, that's not really a fair comparison because normally I would fertilize my oilseed and I wouldn't fertilize my pulse crop. And so if you do that same calculation with, using the fertilized oilseed as to calculate the LER, what you can see is that it's actually fairly fat. In other words, much of the benefit from these crops is because of that nitrogen interaction. Not all of it. There's still some other things going on. There's about a 10% over yielding in the lentil oilseed, and in the pea, it actually increased as the nitrogen deficit decreased. And what was actually probably happening is that these sites were mostly drought stressed and heat stressed, and the pea was able to withstand some of that drought and heat stress better when it was intercropped than when it was just growing by itself. All right, so cool, we've been through a bunch of stuff. What did we really see? Well, certainly we found that you could reduce the nitrogen fertilizer requirements. One of the clear benefits with the intercropping. The other benefits were somewhat less. They're going to vary, of course, because you don't always have the same number of other factors going on. One of the things you kind of look at is, well, this is a pretty good adaptable system. And so in a sense, it's like biological precision ag. So if you've got some parts of your field that are more nitrogen deficit than another, or you have some years that you're thinking of over time, it's just a way to take advantage of these things. So everything might vary, but these things will just adapt and take care of that. Another thing I just wanted to mention was, we just did this with some varieties that were sort of optimized for monocropping. I wonder whether there's a lot more potential if you actually had some development of cultivars. And I know a lot of people who are doing it are actually using some of the older cultivars just because, you know, like in the old days, we got away from the broad, the leafy peas because they wouldn't stand. Well, in an intercrop, they stand just fine. So maybe those guys are now a better option. Another big question for the future is, you know, well, how does getting diversity through time with rotations compared to getting a diversity within a year with intercropping, especially if you don't have enough options. So lots of things to think about still. Here's, I'm just going to leave it at that. Plenty of time. I'm going to stop sharing and throw it over to Matthew, whether he wants me to take some questions now, or what shall we do, Rezvan, and then take questions.
Hi. So yeah, I see there's a couple questions popped up here. I got one raised hand too. We can just do a quick answer for the one question that popped up, and then I think Karen has her hand up too, so we can answer both, and then we'll jump in with Rezvan if that works. So I don't know if Karen, you have a mic. I'll let you talk. Try that. If that works. Maybe not.
Maybe we get her to throw it in the chat, or maybe you'll figure it out for after the thing. And
Yeah.
Sure, I'll be around. I'll answer things. Okay, let's talk.
Okay. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay. So yeah, we'll jump on to our next panelist here today. So our next panelist, Rezvan Karimi, will present on enhancing yield and nutrient use efficiency of crops under subsurface drip fertigation in southern Alberta. Dr. Rezvan Karimi came to Canada in 2010 to begin her doctoral program in the Department of Soil Science at the University of Manitoba. There, her research focused on reducing nutrient loss from agricultural lands to Lake Winnipeg. After graduation, she completed a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Lethbridge. Her research in Alberta focused on the long-term soil nitrogen and carbon dynamics in a century-old wheat experiment. Her interests extend to the fate of nitrogen in Canadian agroecosystems. She is currently a research scientist at the Lethbridge College, where she works on the modeling of soil, water, and nitrogen distribution under subsurface drip irrigation and fertigation systems. Welcome, Rezvan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Matt. So today I'm going to talk about enhancing yield and the nutrient use efficiency of crop under subsurface drip fertigation in southern Alberta. So currently, all of us know that agriculture faces great challenges in producing more crop per drop, or the recent approach of less drop per crop in arid and semi-arid regions. Canada is one of the countries highly affected by climate change, including changing precipitation patterns and seasonal shift. So irrigated agriculture is an important economic driver in the semi-arid area of Canadian prairie provinces, including southern Alberta. You can see in this map that the annual precipitation in southern Alberta, Lethbridge area, is between 300 to 500 millimeter, while we have evaporation in the same area between 700 to 800 millimeter. So the deficit between and difference between evaporation and precipitation, it shows that in this area, agriculture depend on irrigation. And recent announcements of 815 million for Alberta in irrigation infrastructure by the federal, emphasize that irrigated agriculture is going to play even larger role in future. So Alberta accounts for over 2/3 of total area of irrigated land in Canada. And while the most popular irrigation technique in the region remains the low pressure center pivot, the interest in alternative techniques such as SDI and subsurface drip irrigation is increasing. So SDI has its own advantages. Let's say, for example, when you have odd-shaped field, the pivot corners, you can use the SDI for that part of your field. And with a high water use efficiency, more than 95%, and SDI systems are prime candidate for applying nutrient to a crop. That system can release water-soluble fertilizers with irrigation water directly to the root zone of the plant, and that we call it drip fertigation. And drip fertigation can lower the overall fertilizer requirements and increase nutrient use efficiency by synchronizing the application of water and nutrient. Traditionally, nitrogen fertilizer has been applied before planting, either in the fall or spring, but we can apply fertilizer after planting and during vegetative growth stage with fertigation. Advantages of in-season fertilizer application is reduction of nitrogen fertilizer loss through leaching and denitrification during wet spring and increased nitrogen use efficiency. So in this figure, you can see if we apply the whole amount of nitrogen at the beginning of the planting, we're going to have more losses compared when we spoon feed the crop, especially with SDI system that, as I said, nutrient and water can go directly to the root zone. While nitrogen fertilizer remain mobile when we inject into the soil, phosphorus fertilizer are less soluble, less mobile, and highly prone to fixation in the soil. So when fertilizer applied through fertigation, plants can absorb this nutrient, that is phosphorus, directly from the soil solution. Therefore, the objective of this experiment were to quantify the effect of in-season nitrogen and phosphorus application on plant nutrient uptake, yield, and soil nitrogen and phosphorus concentration, to investigate the best timing and scheduling of in-season nitrogen and phosphorus application, and to determine the economic sustainability of in-season nitrogen and phosphorus application. These experiments were conducted in one of the commercial field near community of Lomond, Alberta, Canada. We had 2 crop, durum wheat in 2019 and pinto bean 2020. So overall, we had 16 big zones that SDI lines were installed 20 centimeter below the soil surface with the emitter spacing of 50 centimeter and the flow rate of 0.6 liter per hour. So for 2019, we had 5 treatments, 2022, we had 6 treatments. And since our zones were very big, we went for different experimental design that was completely randomized design. So as I said, with different treatment that I'm going to talk about treatment more. We had a blanket application of fertilizer at the beginning of growing season at the planting time. In 2019, with durum wheat, we applied 72% of total applied in the soil, and phosphorus 54%, and also potassium and sulfur. So for pinto bean in 2022, 67% applied in, again, at the beginning, applied to the soil, with 76% of total applied P. And during the growing season, we had fertigation that we use ammonium nitrate as the nitrogen source and essential phos as the phosphorus source that we apply during the growing season. So the fertigation, we had early application of ammonium nitrate, 28% and 33% in 2019 and 2020. Early application of essential phos, and then application of nitrogen and phosphorus, early application at the same time, split application of nitrogen, late application of nitrogen, and control that we didn't apply any fertigation during the growing season. So for 2019, 4 times phosphorus and 7 times nitrogen every third day, starting at 4-leaf durum wheat growth stage, was the early application. And for the late nitrogen treatment, it is started 25 of June. For 2020, 8 times phosphorus were applied, and 4 times nitrogen every day. And for a split application, July 9th for 2 days, and then again July 14th for 2 days. Late application, July 14th for 4 days. For the sampling, we did the soil sampling 3 times, spring before planting, mid-season after fertigation, and harvest. So we got the soil samples from 2 different locations along the lateral, between 2 emitters and across the laterals. So around 50 centimeter away from the lateral drip line, between the emitters, to take the soil and analyzing for nutrients and also for soil moisture. For at 3 depths, the 0 to 30 centimeter, 30 to 60 centimeter, and 60 to 90 centimeter. For biomass, we collected biomass 4 times before fertigation, and during growing season after fertigation 2 times, and at harvest. So because of the variability that we had, we increased the amount of subsamples. Instead of 2 meters square, we went for 4 meters square, and we calculated the yield based on ton per hectare. So let's move on to the results. For 2019, durum grain yield was significantly greater in N received treatment and N plus P, 9.3 megagram per hectare and 9.4 megagram, versus that was significantly greater than control, 6.8 megagram per hectare. The same trend we saw in nitrogen and phosphorus uptake that nitrogen and nitrogen plus phosphorus shows significantly greater uptake than control. And this is for N uptake, and for P uptake the same. So the result shows that applying phosphorus alone had little influence on durum weight, but phosphorus application with N show a substantial response. 2020, for pentobane, there was no statistical differences between the control plots and any other treatment that received additional fertigation. And for N uptake and for P uptake, it's the same result. For irrigation water use efficiency and nitrogen and phosphorus use efficiency, for 2019, you can see nitrogen plus phosphorus show significantly greater irrigation water use efficiency than control. For 2022, the same result as nitrogen and phosphorus uptake and yield. There is no difference between treatment for irrigation water use efficiency. For nitrogen use efficiency and phosphorus use efficiency, for nitrogen, all the treatments received nitrogen show significantly higher nitrogen use efficiency than only treatment that only receive phosphorus. And for phosphorus use efficiency, you can see the phosphorus use efficiency for treatment that receive only phosphorus, it's significantly lower than nitrogen ones and late nitrogen. So how we got the nitrogen use efficiency and phosphorus use efficiency, we subtract the amount of uptake from each treatment from the amount of uptake from control and divide it to yield of the control plots. For soil nitrate concentration, I brought the result of across the lateral, and for nitrate concentration, this is for 2019 and 2020. For both, for 2020, you can see the late nitrogen treatment and split nitrogen application. They show the higher concentration of nitrate in a soil that we cannot recommend these two in case of environmental concern. So for net return income, we just calculated how much farmers can get back with fertigation application. And how we calculated, it's the net return in Canadian dollar per hectare. Y is crop yield, P is the commodity price. And so we calculate all the yield and multiply to price per unit, and then subtract from the all cost of the fertilizer, pesticide, seed, everything. So we wanted to have a net, show the net return from the fertigation application. And so in 2019, you can see the best and the highest was application of nitrogen and phosphorus together, and application of nitrogen that was significantly higher than control. But for 2020, if we compare the treatment receive amendment or receive fertilizer through drip line compared to control, it's less. So almost 15% less than control, which didn't receive any fertilizer during the growing season. And the reason was that if I go back to the precipitation, both years had a normal precipitation compared to 15 years of cumulative data. But for 2020, in May and June, we had high precipitation, and therefore the treatment that received the fertigation, they had a very dense canopy, and with the warm weather and wet atmosphere, we had a white mold, and the mold decreased the yield. So we cannot just manage the amount of water or just manage the nutrient and apply nutrient, and we think that, okay, the more nutrient we apply, the more we get in yield. So irrigation management would be more important in case if you have more precipitation, you cannot apply a lot of nutrient that cause damages later on. So as a summary, we can say in 2019, net return data showed that increased yield in N and N plus P treatment were large enough to offset the increased input cost. But additional nitrogen and phosphorus applications via subsurface drip irrigation did not improve the pinto beans yield cost effectively in 2020. And late and split application of N showed the greatest concentration of N throughout the soil profile. Therefore, economically and environmentally, these two treatments are not desirable, specifically for years with wet growing season. So for a demo farm that we get from Alberta Ag 2 or 3 years ago, we had a 15-acre parcel here, and we have different zone that control independently. So we have SDI system here, and this year was the second year. The first year we just planted silage corn to uptake the excess of nutrients. And this year we started an experiment to see how much we can apply the fertilizer at the beginning and how much during the growing season, and see that the ratio between application to the soil versus application through drip line. So our treatment was 20% of the nitrogen at the beginning of the growing season, application to the soil with 100% phosphorus, the treatment to 75% of N applied at the beginning at planting time, and 100% phosphorus. And then the treatment 3 is 50% N and 50% P at the beginning of the growing season applied to the soil, and the remaining 50% N and 50% P during the growing season applied through the drip line, and see how these 3 different treatments can have different yield or no, and how is the loss of the nutrients through soil profile. And at the end, I appreciate your time and all the summer students and our technician to help me for that project. So if you have any question.
Thanks, Rezvan. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A box, or if you raise your hand up too, I can just click on you and you can answer through the mic if you wish. Yeah, no, I found both topics really interesting, especially when we're talking about sustainability and efficiently using the water sources and nutrients for agriculture purposes. I find both of them fascinating myself. One question I do have, I'll start off, I guess. Eric, I know you're familiar with subpulse and canola crops. I saw one an interesting intercrop last year. It was wheat and flax. Do you see that very often? And if it's
yeah, I've seen stuff like that. Very rare.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, those are very different things going on. It's interesting, but I really haven't both seen it in practice and seen it in research. Common ones though are like a lot of people have been doing intercropping with chickpea and flax and stuff like that because there's a lot of disease benefits there. So that's one that I've seen much more often.
Yeah, I thought it was just interesting. I was spraying along the roadside there, and I was like, "Well, what's going on here?" And I walked through, and I was like, "Oh, I've never seen that one before." So, in the Q&A, I see. So we got two questions here. One from Mark. I think this one's directed for you there, Eric. So maybe I missed it, but are these studies considering soil biodiversity? Because it is not the plants that fix N, but the bacteria that may or may not be present in that soil.
Good question. So it is the bacteria that fix the nitrogen. These are the rhizobium species, but these bacteria really only efficiently fix nitrogen is when they infect those roots and they grow these nodules. So it's a symbiotic relationship. Okay. Now, those rhizobium are naturally in the soil, and we also add them with inoculants. And we certainly did in these things, just because it's a very specific things, and you have to have the right rhizobium with the different, lentil and pea have the same one, but it's different than faba, is different from alfalfa. It's always different. So my sense is that there was, just looking at nodules and stuff and just knowing how they work, there was probably sufficient around to do the job. And I don't think that's why the intercropping fixed more. It's probably just because they really was more competitive, and so they needed to fix more. That's just one influence. There's a lot of bacteria and other microbes in the soil. And we actually had one researcher from Canada do some sampling of that. And I'm really not, it gets really complicated when they start doing all the genetics and stuff. And so I still don't know whether there's anything else that came out of that. Yeah, that's what we did. And that's why I think we saw what we did.
You came up with a follow-up there. So just wondering if that counts for the different level of N. Thanks for mentioning the inoculants.
Yeah. Important.
Okay. And then another one for you here, Eric, from Matthew Gosling. Is there any cereal fit for intercrops? Have you tried seeding different species of wheat or barley to measure results?
I've, way back in the 1980s, I played around a little bit with some of that. It's actually fairly common. Matter of fact, growing up, we always grew oat pea barley mix for our dairy cattle. Very nice intercropping system. Been a lot of research on that all over the place. By and large, I know the guys who do a lot of crop producing with intercropping, they just find that they get better results when they put the oil, the broadleaves together rather than the cereals with the pulse crops. And a few reasons for that. I'm not, you can get similar benefits, but I don't know whether it's maybe quite as consistent. And I think maybe part of it is crop like barley is very competitive with the pulse crops. And then maybe, if you're in a situation where you got too much nitrogen in the soil, they just end up, out competing it. But again, if you're trying to do this in situations where you got really not that much, then it's a really good way of getting, extra protein feed from, an intercropping of cereals and pulse crops. So yeah, there's quite a bit around, but not as much on a crop production for seed.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Surprising, everybody's quiet today, early Monday morning. Oh, nice, we got another one here, that's good. Okay, so from Mark again, so N+P applications. With increasing demands of high nutrient food, will this method increase the nutritional value of our crops? I believe that one's for you, Rezvan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I didn't show the result of the concentration. Yes, it increased the concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus in grain.
Sure. And I guess just my own question for you, Rezvan. I know you were looking at you have that field plot there. I don't know what you have for gopher populations and stuff out there. I know in southern Alberta, there's you have gophers, you got badgers. Did you find any damage with your piping system, anything like that on your I guess test plots?
Yes. For demo farm, actually this year we started irrigation a little bit late due to damages that we had in line, but I talked with different people, Southern Irrigation, and also different farmers. They use this kind of, I think, specific material to kill them. Yeah, and it depends the location of the farm. Some farmers, they don't have any problem, but some of them, yes, the population of gopher mouses.
No, yeah, I was just curious by that. Oh, we have another question. Good. Oh, Mark just says, thanks, great presentations. So what else? Okay. Any other questions before I throw up the QR codes? Okay. Oh. Chanel is just asking if we have more questions, where can we email you or the presenters? You can, I don't know if you guys want to put your emails out there. I can, you can certainly email them to me at mwells@leftcounty.ca, and I can forward it to Eric and Rezvan. If that works, I'll just throw that in the chat there too. I can.
You threw my email in there. So.
Okay.
But it's got questions. Happy to take them.
Okay. Two other questions popped up. Great. Let's see here. Oh, perfect. Thanks. Okay. I'd like to thank everyone that was able to join us today. A special thanks to Eric and Rezvan for the presentation. You guys were wonderful. I found it really enjoyable, and very informative. And so I appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to do that for us. Please join us again next Monday, January 30th at 10 o'clock, where Leo Sobrino from Olds College will present on technologies available for remote management and monitoring rotationally grazed pastures. And Bob Hoffos from Olds College will present on drones and digital mapping in agriculture. So yeah, thanks everybody.